Great, that's a cue to make a start then. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this lunchtime webinar. This is the second in the series of webinars by Let's Face Change, and we are in partnership with Odd-Arts. So the idea of this webinar and future webinars is to focus on what mental health practitioners can do about racism. So just about Let's Face Change, we started as a group, as a campaign idea. We've gained lots of momentum support from you guys since a conference last year in Manchester, where we held a space to connect with others like yourselves and encourage conversations, mainly about exploring and tackling diversity and racial inequalities in mental health services. So these seminars are a follow-up opportunity to keep the conversations going, and we hope to sort of build the momentum for a conference again this year in about November time.
Thanks, Uzi. Yeah, again, we're excited to see so many of you here, and also excited to introduce Dr. Jeri Tikare, who will be leading this seminar. A bit about Jeri. Jeri works. 1 minute. There you go. Jeri works as a clinical psychologist for Kooth and uses compassion-focused principle to help with his work. Outside of work, Jeri's a big football fan and supports Arsenal. Think of that what you will. And he's also a father to 3 boys. Today, Jeri will reflect on his personal narrative, combining professional and personal experiences, and how making links with compassion-focused principles has helped him in his journey.
In a final note, we really encourage people to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. For anything else, any comments or reflections, please just stick to the chat function. I'm going to hand over to Jeri now to start us off with the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yep, I can.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Jeri. Thank you so much for the introduction. Hopefully today, what we'll be talking about is really talking you through what I call a bottom top attempt to reduce racism in the profession using self-compassion. I must say that this is my stories I'm hopefully going to share in the hope that it can start to help people see how I managed to self-compassion or compassion-focused principles to help navigate some of the challenges I faced. Hopefully today, what we'll be covering, we'll be having a brief introduction to compassion, and we'll spend time talking about aspects of compassion-focused principles, which is a 3 circles model. We'll talk a little bit about how, on a systemic level, some of the things that we're doing to combat racism in our profession, and we'll use the 3 circles analogy to help illustrate this. Thereafter, I'll be spending some time talking about some of my stories. I'll be talking specifically about some of the stories that had a lasting, shocking impact on myself. And thereafter, the option will be to invite people to incorporate aspects of self-compassion to facilitate our ability to turn up as our authentic self, to combat what I call the threat of not knowing. And we'll end obviously by offering some space for thoughts and reflections. So, introduction to compassion. In compassion mind training, we describe compassion as a sensitivity to suffering in the self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. I guess there are a few things I want us to note in terms of the definition. The first one is the sensitivity to suffering. So aligning ourselves with our suffering, being in touch with our suffering. So from my perspective, being sensitive, aligning myself, being in touch with the distress around my Blackness. And a commitment as a second bit, motivation, a drive to try to do something to alleviate and prevent it. So those two things are key in terms of when we think about compassionate mind training and what compassion is. And aspects of compassion-focused therapy are centered around evolutionary psychology, which is really about our innate motivation to survive as human beings, centered around what we call emotion regulating systems. And some of these emotion regulating systems include what we call a threat focused system. This really is a system that is centered around responding to threats in our environment. It triggers the fight or flight response, but it helps us to react quickly to potential dangers or things that we perceive as dangerous to our existence. We also have, the threat system is associated with emotions such as anger, anxiety, and disgust. Then we have the drive system, which is really a system linked to our desires, our goals, our motivations. It's really associated with feeling excitement, enthusiasm, and determination. And finally, we have what we call the soothing system, which is a system that helps us to calm down, helps us to feel safe, helps us to feel connected. And the key thing is that what we want is for there to be a balance amongst all these three systems that we have. But the challenge in life is that based on our socialization, based on our experiences, and lots of things that are not really our fault, for some reasons in different periods in our life, there's an imbalance in some of these systems within us, within the systems that we work in our places of work. It's helpful to think about some of the occurrences from this three circles model. I find it very useful. So it's aspects of the threats that we can struggle with is the threat of not knowing, the threat of changes and the impact that could have on us. The impact, and some of these threats cause us sometimes to engage in our drive system, and our drive system is primarily not used to counteract threats. We have an inbuilt system that is made to counteract threats, but sometimes we engage in behaviors to help us manage this threat, but we use our drive system. So hopefully there's an invitation for us to begin to start to notice using the story different systems at work and at play, and how some of these engagements and the use of the drive system actually maintain some of the difficulties that I experienced and maybe some of the difficulties we experience as a society. Another helpful way to help us start to see how these three systems align themselves in the work we're doing to combat racism involves what I call how the kind of work that we're doing systematically to combat racism. So there's a massive threat around not knowing, and there are loads of things in place, such as policies around recruitment, cultural sensitivity training, anti-racism advocacy, ensuring that we have more of a diverse workforce. And there's a lot more research on racism and mental health. All these things are being done from what I call a top-bottom process to help manage and counteract that threat of not knowing and hopefully reduce racism in our profession. Now, the challenge with some of these things are that sometimes we can feel like it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and we're not actually seeing changes that we want to see. So hopefully today, my hope is that through my stories, we can start to see how, as a society, we can start to use some of these concepts of self-compassion to start to see what we can do from a bottom-top perspective. So see what we can do ourselves to effect change. Okay, so hopefully I will share my stories, and I hope that as I share, you can start to, as I said, notice the different systems at work in as I share my stories. So I always talk about being my parents as being a nomad because they moved around a lot. But when I was a lot younger, but I would say I spent a significant part of my formative years in Nigeria. And that was very helpful in terms of helping me understand my heritage, understand a lot of things about myself, understand who my parents' parents were, who my parents' parents were, and which were very, very useful in helping me form an identity and understanding of who I am. You know, one thing I was mindful in terms of my socialization, my parents never spoke our language to us, you know, and I found that very, very interesting. Generally, I'm aware of my privilege and the opportunities that I had because I was born into the home that I was born into, and I guess that's key in terms of some of the stories I will share with you later. Another significant part of what I'll call some of my some experiences some things I went through that I experienced as shocking was after my first degree in psychology. I went to America to work for a while, and what I noticed from this experience was the level of anger that I've never experienced before in my life. You know, up to a point where I was really, really concerned about staying in America, you know, the level of aggression and how quickly some people went from 0 to what you might call like 100 very, very quickly in a short space of time for things that, you know, to me were maybe very trivial from my perspective. Maybe someone maybe stepped on your shoes and it was very, very common and very, very and it was everywhere. And this feeling stayed with me because I never experienced that sort of thing in any environment that I was before in my life, you know, and this is very powerful. You know, another significant experience, and what I'll again describe as really shocking is the experience of not feeling part of. I guess when I share this story, it's important to know that people involved are aware that I'm sharing the story, and I think it's very helpful in terms of us moving forward and see how we can, again, tackle racism. So this is what I would describe as my multicultural family. But it's not always been this way. I've experienced not feeling part of. I remember when I started to date my wife, well, I had a good enough relationship with my father-in-law. However, issues began to arise when it became obvious that we were serious, you know, and however, and my wife, I remember she was very, very upset, also shocked as I was. She was shocked at the reaction of her parents, you know. However, we decided to focus on what we describe as love. And from our perspective, it's just showing forth as the children that we want to be, as opposed to reacting to what was going on. You know, in that vein, when we decided to get married, I went down to ask for my wife's hand in marriage. And we had some difficult conversations during this visit. And some of the conversations that we had were conversations around what our children would look like, you know, as me being Black and my wife being white, you know, conversations around what will we put in our children through by getting married. Just, you know, what the kind of suffering that will be putting our children through by getting married. You know, it was really, really obviously shocking because I never thought about anything like that before. So on the one hand, whilst it was shocking for me, I think it's helpful to see things from the other perspective, where basically how this was very new, this was different, this was not also in their line of thinking, how this change, this difference, this sense of difference was a threat, a potential threat to them. And it was really, really challenging, and it was difficult for them to also comprehend, because it's not something that they were used to. Also, this is the threat of not knowing, or the unknown. This was very, very difficult, a difficult day, because I remember leaving the house with my wife and, having this kind of like out of body experience, in a state of shock. And, and my wife and I used to have a conversation before this about, how I used to feel funny when I'm on the street, and people from minority groups, or most specifically Black people, expect me to nod or acknowledge them. And I remember, and I used to think, why can't you just nod and acknowledge? Why don't you just say hello to everyone, as opposed to trying to connect with me? And I remember specifically on this day, walking along the street and just looking for someone that was Black or from a minority group, just to feel a sense of connection, just to feel like I was okay as a person. I remember some of the things I was saying to myself to soothe myself. I kept telling myself that you're someone's son, you're someone's son. And that's how some of those things left me feeling, and this kind of narrative is, it's in my family, conversations about, I remember going to my uncle-in-law's place one day, and he said to me that, Jeri, there must be something wrong. You've been drinking too much. There must be something wrong with your skin. You've been drinking too much coffee. And I can never forget, laughing, at the joke, because to them at that point in time, it was a joke, and I could see things from their perspective. Some of these experiences obviously left me feeling like there was something wrong with me in terms of my Blackness. Unconsciously, not consciously. And attempts to start to mask my Blackness became really evident to me when I was working as a PWP, and I was about to begin to deliver therapy. And I remember having sleepless nights as to what I was going to wear, because I was concerned that people would see my Blackness and see that I was not able to offer any help. I couldn't care for them or be in touch with their difficulties. And I literally planned what I was going to wear to be able to, so people would see what I was wearing, as opposed to seeing my Blackness. And this narrative around putting a mask and covering our Blackness is something that is also evident in my place of work, and so many experiences that I've had. Part of my work at the moment involves offering clinical support to our practitioners. And I remember having 3 sessions back to back. I used to wonder actually why people from minority groups and Black people just gravitated towards me. I'm the only Black person in the clinical team. And on this particular day, I had back-to-back sessions with 3 Black women, and who didn't know each other. And the narrative of their narrative on that day was the fact that they couldn't talk about their distress or the feelings that they had around what was going on at work at that point in time, because of a fear of being seen as a Black angry woman. Hence, they silenced themselves. And this was something that they were used to, keeping quiet and conforming because of that fear, that threat of not being seen as a particular person. Now, one of the experiences, on the shocking experiences that put everything together for me, is an experience I had in front of my mother's house, where I was just stood there waiting for my mom to come. And I was listening to music, enjoying myself after work one day. And a white man came to me, and he said, well, can I help you? And I was like, oh, and I told him no, I'm fine. Or do I need directions? I told him I was fine, and I thought it was being kind. I continued listening to my music. And then he came again and he asked me, do I need any help? That, what was I doing there? And I told him I was waiting for my mom, and I thought it was just being helpful, put my music back on. And he came to me the 3rd time and he asked me for where exactly my mom's house was. And that's when I realized what he was doing. That's when I realized, and the reaction was shocking. My reaction was shocking to what he was doing. I remember screaming at the top of my lungs that, can you see what you're doing? Can you actually see what you're doing? Do you know that what you're doing has cost the life of so many people, what you're actually doing? And I'm sure maybe he didn't understand where I was coming from, but just the realization of what he was doing at that point in time. And because I was party to it, you know, he told me I was going to call the police, you know, I was going to call the police because I shouldn't be where I was. And he just went on and on and on, you know. And what struck me is the fact that I felt like I could defend myself. I was articulate enough. You know, I was in front of my mom's house, and I just wanted people that can't do that or struggle with doing that. And just made me think about the so many challenges that we have, and everything at that point in time to me made sense. Now, the thing about how it leaves you feeling is that it's so easy. Actually, on that day, I remember swearing in reaction to this man, and this was a massive part. This was difficult because that was against my values, and you know, I felt again ashamed at the fact that I swore. And it's so easy for me to give into that shame and then be silenced as a result of that encounter and not confront those kind of difficulties. And that's the thing about shame. Shame is a very powerful, complex emotion. You see, is in us to want to connect. You know, we're driven to want to connect with people, to feel part of a group, you know, because it enhances our chances of survival, you see, you know. And so basically, when we feel ashamed, it's so easy to give in to the norms of the group and conform to the group. And this is what I felt doing, conforming, code switching, you know, changing my language and how I sound, the fear of just sounding as Jeri, altering physical appearance. Right? We have friends and families who talk about their children who's trying to scrub their skin to remove the blackness, downplaying my racial identity, modifying my names in order to conform, you know, passive anger, suppressing our emotions, being silenced, not having a voice because of that fear of not being seen as the angry Black woman. Now, you see, that's a way of us managing our threats of not connecting, not being part of, again, using our drive system. However, that sort of maintains the difficulty because when we put ourselves up as these versions of us that are not authentic, what it does, it stops other people from actually seeing our true selves and dealing with the threats of the unknown. So that sort of maintains racism when we put up these barriers and these walls up. And that's what I've learned from this process. The invitation today is for us to begin to develop a compassionate self and tap into our soothing system. And to do that, we need to walk towards embracing our common humanity, understanding that, you know, we didn't choose where we're going to be born. There's so much about ourselves that are that we didn't choose, that were gene built and socially shaped. Begin to pay mindful attention to some of our unconscious responses. Because it's so easy for me to have gone ahead and just lived my life without paying attention to some of the things that I did, like the kind of clothes that I wore and my fear of disconnection because of putting on certain clothes. Tapping into the same wisdom of knowing that, you know, we're all in the same boat. Empathy for my good reasons for engaging in certain behaviors, engaging in some of these safety behaviors. Empathy for the part of me that swore on that day in reaction to my experience, but also a commitment to actually doing something about my suffering and my suffering in relation to my relationship with my Blackness. And I can't say that doing this is going to be easy because it's scary. The fear of disconnection is real. Hence, mustering up courage and embracing our vulnerability is a massive part in terms of us showing up as our authentic, true selves. You know, and part of doing this involves recognizing that there are systemic challenges that are not our fault. There's so many things out there that might be very tricky to change, but how we respond to these things matter. How we start to begin to imbibe these aspects of ourself, which is our compassionate self, to begin to counter negative self-perceptions resulting from our race or your race. Compassion for the complexities, because it's a hard job and it feels like you're going on again and again and again, you know, to battle this fatigue, to battle fatigue and tiredness and sometimes the motivation to give up, and courage to have celebrating our diversity, in my case, my Blackness, so that ought to celebrate my Blackness. Courage to have open conversations about it, and being in touch with our anger and channeling it appropriately. So this is the picture of like my multicultural family, you know, as a result of embracing compassion. You know, it feels as if we're more of a family. You know, it's helped me develop a part of me that so developing a part of me that was compassionate has been really, really helpful in this regard. It's helped me to connect to a part of myself that is strong and grounded enough to confront some of the challenges that occur as a result of my Blackness, but also wise enough to understand people's good reasons for behaving in particular ways, but also helping me to be committed to find ways for sticking up for myself and people around me in a way that feels assertive and helpful. And this has been useful in this regard. It's given me space to be able to challenge some of the things within my family, challenge some of the ways that they think, and give them space to be able to start to consider thinking about things from a different perspective, you know, about things of the world. And this is the beautiful thing about it, is that we're able to come together to have a multicultural wedding where basically aspects of my wife's culture and her heritage were celebrated, and aspects of my culture and heritage were celebrated. And it was just a beautiful union of cultures. So the invitation today is for us to have a think about the walls that we've all put up, because we're all human. We put those walls up for good reasons. And think about the things that stop us from turning up as our authentic selves, and start to think about things that we might need to make changes. Because we know that if you want to change the world, you have to start with yourself. The end. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm mindful that some of the things I might have shared might have brought up things for people. Yeah, so I'm happy to answer questions as well.
Thank you so much, Jeri, for sharing your story there. It's so very powerful. There have been some questions that have come up in the chat, so I'll ask them to you if that's all right. And if I could maybe start with one, I know the focus of this talk has been for you about kind of the bottom to top approach. You mentioned the other more systemic approaches, but something about working bottom to top. Could I ask a little bit more about what has been the impact on you of taking that approach?
That's a very good question. The impact has been powerful. I think it's given me freedom. Freedom from the bondage of the shame associated with my Blackness. And I must say, compassion is a motivation. So it's not something that comes naturally to me. I push myself to be compassionate. Using some of those things that we talked about, I push myself to engage in conversations when I feel it's important, when I feel, when I feel I can make a change, as opposed to staying silent. Because sometimes it's just easy to silence and hide. But I use supervision. That's very helpful in terms of giving me the space to be able to be articulate enough to be able to build up what I need to say, to challenge some of the things that are everywhere, my place of work, and different places. So yes.
Thank you. Thank you. And there's a couple of comments in about thinking about other people's approach. Like one of the first questions that came up was thinking about whose job it was to tackle racism, and thinking about should the emphasis be on allies, as people who've experienced racism are experiencing daily microaggressions and are really exhausted by that process. So I'd be really interested to hear your responses to that.
So who's responsible?
Yeah, whose job is it to combat racism?
I think that it's all our jobs. I think it's the responsibility for everyone. I think that, when we can create that space where we can have these useful conversations where there's no blame, it comes from a place of understanding of our humanity. And I think compassion therapy is very helpful in that regard if we can see it from a perspective of threats and people's good reasons why they do what they do, even though it's seen in a particular way. Then we can start to have those conversations from my perspective, because when I think about it personally, I'm thinking about their motivation at that point in time, and how far we've come in terms of the kind of conversations that we've had, in terms of how we've been able to create a space where we can start to challenge some of the things and their way of thinking. I think it's a responsibility for all of us, first and foremost, for us to be able to speak up first and foremost, but also to be able to speak up in a way that people will be able to hear us.
And Ali, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Thanks, Jeri, for sharing your stories. They were really powerful and kind of sat with me a lot. I suppose my question is, how can, do you have any advice on how staff who work with people who've experienced or have the kind of anger you spoke about, how they can do that? Because, as we know, that unconscious biases might come into play and such, and how can they sort of maybe manage their feelings whilst also helping someone that helps?
So you're talking about this, how a staff team can help? Is that, sorry, I didn't get the question.
Yeah, like any advice on how staff can use maybe compassion focused principles to think about how they can help someone who may have experienced the kind of anger or has that kind of anger you spoke about?
Yeah, so to me, I think it will be dependent on who this I think it will be dependent on the ethnicity of the staff member first and foremost. I think one of the principles around compassion focused therapy is really bracing yourself for something that is difficult. And I guess I've had the privilege of, and I'm lucky to have supervisors in my life who are mindful of what's having these kind of conversations bring up for them as we talk, and they're open to being vulnerable in the conversations that we have. So, supervisor that or a staff team member who conversations like this bring up their threat system and they react in ways that might not be helpful could make it challenging for us to navigate those kind of processes. So I feel like what we need to, I think from an organizational perspective, we need to create a space where those kind of conversations can be had. So there has to be some, in my opinion, spaces where people can feel safe enough to begin to talk about these kind of things, and that's why it's not one person's responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility, so that people can feel free enough to talk about, people from minority groups can feel safe enough to come into a space, and that space is shared and it's not from a place of where they feel safe enough to talk about these difficult things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeri. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A as well around embracing diversity. So some questions, there's one question around how do we get people from other races to understand our Blackness? And this idea of how can you do that without having to fit in some way as well. So,
So the question is really about how we can get other people to understand the challenges with our Blackness. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the question.
Without conforming. That's not the word you used, yeah.
Yeah, and there was another question about not having to fit in.
Fit in. Okay. Yeah. So I would say that I would say again, using the compassion focus principles, I feel is a very humanistic way of talking about the difficulties and the distress and the pain resulting from racism. And I don't think it's an easy conversation to have because it can bring up difficult feelings for people. But I feel like if we can look at it from a perspective using CFT as an approach to look at people's good reasons why, from an evolution perspective, why do people do those things? And it can maybe take away the shame from maybe people are from other, maybe for people who are not from minority groups who perceive it as a sense of threat when those kind of conversations are had. It can take away the shame and maybe give them space to be able to think about, the need for putting measures in place to feel that, so people can don't feel they need to put walls up or need to conform, where we need to start to learn to embrace difference, where we imbibe a culture of working to learn people's names, for example, as opposed to people feeling the need to have to shorten their names to adapt to a particular group of people, where we can actually make that effort to actually say, I'm going to take my time to learn this, because it's important, those kind of subtle things. I think also us showing up, as our true self, mustering up the courage to turn up as your true self, and openly challenge people that might talk about, and be willing to engage in those conversations. Like, so what are your good reasons why? I'm going to call you. So my name is maybe whatever. Think about a name and I'm going to call you this because it's easier. I don't know. It's being able to say, no, that's not my name. My name is XYZ. Why do you feel the need to call me a name that is not my name? So us also being able to be courageous enough to challenge some of these things, and I know it's challenging, and I know it's easier sometimes to just conform and but then if we're having this conversation about making any changes by conforming, we're actually maintaining racism. So I feel like, it's really about the courage to stop ourselves, notice the areas where we conform and even the subtle things that we do, and begin to, again, have the courage to turn up us as our true selves.
Thanks, Jeri. We have a couple of raised hands. I'm not sure what it means, but bear with me if I think. Carlos?
Hello?
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, just wanted to say, it's really interesting hearing your story and your practice. I think it's really important. I think I said some things in the question. For me, I appreciate what you're saying, but for me, I think it's about other races having more equality and diversity and inclusion training. You know, sometimes if you say you're in the workplace, we shouldn't be having to feel that we need to fit into their society. They need to be understanding us and respecting us and where our culture is. A lot of the times it's about the emphasis is on us, and it shouldn't be, because we're the minority, and that needs to change if we're ever going to get change or reduce racism. I'll give an example. Some people judge people just on the way they look, the color of the skin. So if you're, you know, I'm a Black person, I'm in work, am I seen as equal as some others? Probably not, no. I may have not even have opened my mouth yet, but it's having them opportunities. Unfortunately, we don't get all the same opportunities to express ourselves in different ways. And I think it's important that there needs to be more additional training on how we reduce them stigmas and stereotypes, so that people are able to feel comfortable with who they are. Because I think you touched on something about, if you're not being able to be yourself, then that is going to have an impact on your mental health and your well-being, and how you see yourself and how you identify. And if you're not able to feel yourself, that's going to have an effect on your practice and your personal circumstances as well. And I think that area is really important, that is addressed, not just in the workplace, but as a society in general. So I think there has to be some emphasis on practitioners being able to collaborate more, but I think race being a bit more of a priority on the agenda of how we reduce this.
Thank you, Carlos. That's very helpful to hear. Yeah, and I agree with you. I feel like we could do more. There's so much more that we could do. And I always say that we could do more, but I also want us to be able to celebrate the fact that we're doing a lot. Even to me, the fact that we're having this conversation now, to me, I feel is something to be celebrated. And I feel like we can have more platforms like this where, you know, and so maybe to align myself with what you're saying now is maybe more platforms like this where we can have conversations like this, where we can talk a little bit more about this in a way that doesn't feel finger pointing, doesn't feel judgmental, but, you know, feels human. You know, I think we need more platforms like that. So I agree with you, Carlos.
Thank you. We did have another raised hand, but it's disappeared. So did that person still want to raise their hand? I think it's gone. Oh wait, we do have one. So okay, more are coming up. Okay. Joe, I think.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you, Joe.
Okay, so thank you, Jeri, for sharing your story, and hi everyone. I think that discrimination, you know, is something that has been within us from the onset, and I believe that one of the ways for us to go about it is kind of orientation to everyone, because it's not only race that is being discriminated, also status in workplace. Think about the senior staff and the junior staff, people's culture, and what have you. And most of the time, you know, we tend to kind of neglect all these discriminations, you know, depending on where it's coming from. You know, like, say, for instance, if it's coming from the people who are poorly that we are caring for, we think that maybe it's because of their mental health condition. You know, that's how they don't know what they're doing. And most of the time, these things are not reported. And I believe that if we keep on reporting the occurrence of all these discriminations, it will continue occurring all the time, and most of the time as well, when it's being reported, it's not being addressed the way it's supposed. So I think a lot of work is still need to be done if we really need to, I will not say to tackle racism or discrimination, but if we need to talk about it, because I don't think that we have started talking about it. And for us to tackle it, we need to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. And I think you raised a few important points there. I always try to again, I think the model really helps us to understand things from a perspective of difference and the threats that difference brings. And you've talked about a few different aspects of ways that we can be different. So you talked about hierarchies at work, you talked about people that struggle with their mental health and other things. Yeah, I agree with you. Again, race is another challenge that we all have with difference, and again, putting more effort into ensuring that we're more of an inclusive society. I think it's helpful. So thank you, Joe.
And I'm aware we've got lots of questions in the Q&A. We might not have time to answer all of them, but if it's all right, what we'll do is we'll pose them to you, Jeri, maybe if you have a chance to answer them afterwards, and then we could share that with people who've attended. Is it all right? I think we might have time to ask one more, if that's okay, Jeri, before we kind of wrap up. And there's a question in here about wondering if there might be a risk of centering white feelings if we over-focus on compassion. When people and systems are perpetuating racism, sort of knowingly or unknowingly.
So what's the word you said? What about white feelings?
Yeah, a risk of centering white feelings if we over-focus on compassion.
I think those feelings are important. I think those feelings are, in order for us to be able to effect any change, as long as it's not one that is aggressive or like that is untoward. When the feelings that I think that if we're going to effect any change, it's important for us to create a space to listen to where those feelings come from, and that's my hope, because I feel like, we talked about anger, there are different types of anger, I feel like compassion helps us to channel the anger in a way that feels useful to achieve what our motivation is. Our motivation is to reduce racism. That's our motivation. I feel like it's so easy for us to engage in use our anger to a point where it arouses feelings of threat, and at that point in time there's no conversation that can be had. There's no space for a sense of connection, in any way, shape, or form. So from my perspective, I feel like, I can see, where I can see where so compassion is not an excuse for aggression. It's not, and compassion shouldn't be seen as weakness. There's a lot of strength that comes from compassion, being able to stand up for oneself in a way that feels assertive and powerful, but also being able to hold in mind what the other person's threats are and being able to negotiate that and be able to communicate in a way that the other person can hear. But that's what I feel anyway, and I'm mindful that there might be dangers, but I feel like with this approach, especially from the way I'm looking at it is what we can do for ourselves. So from a systemic perspective and from an organizational perspective, there might be some of these subtle challenges. But if we're thinking about what we can do from a bottom top perspective, what we can do to start to effect those changes, those are the things that are within our power to do to start to effect the change that we want and reduce racism.
Thank you, Jeri.
Thank you, Jeri. Thanks. And thanks for, being part of our talk today. Think found it very powerful and really a lot to reflect on, a lot to think about. We do have a lot of questions in the Q&A, just to let you know. So as Jen said, we'll pose them to you and then maybe, you could answer them a bit after and we can send them out to attendees. That's okay with you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Just before we finish up as well, because it kind of links to some of the questions or reflections we've had in the Q&A, I'd like to share this project we're doing as part of our conference later this year. So we are working in partnership with ADOTS on a piece of verbatim theatre, which will be using people's personal stories verbatim and sort of using theatre to share their experiences. So if anyone feels interested in sharing anything, if you feel comfortable doing it, we're looking for stories of all forms of racism, lack of diversity in services, and the impact this has had on people, whether this is personal experience or witnessing or anything, or any reflections, that would be great. If you could just email jade@adots.co.uk, that would be wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I think that might be the end of the webinar now. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Hope to see you at the next one.
You can go to now.